Music is the soundtrack of our lives. Our music.
Hello and welcome to Season 2 of Mark on Media. This is Episode 1, Part 1, and in tribute to one of my musical heroes, I'll be focusing heavily on David Bowie in the forthcoming episodes. Longtime fans will have read and know a lot of the information in the shows, but when a couple of friends who have recently got into David Bowie told me they liked his cover of a Nirvana song, and then proceeded to tell me how amazed they were that the Pet Shop Boys had got him to sing on one of their singles, well, I just had to act. In February and March of 1970, David Bowie, producer-bassist Tony Visconti, and guitarist Mick Ronson began demoing songs at Bowie's home, Haddon Hall, for what would become one of my favourite albums, The Man Who Sold the World. The Man Who Sold the World. It's hard to believe it's been 45 years since the release of The Man Who Sold the World. In 1972, according to officialcharts.com, it attained a respectable number 26 chart position in the UK, but fared less well in the US, peaking at number 105. But over the years, it's an album that's grown in stature. According to ultimateclassicrock.com, sales have now reached around 1.5 million. In the 1970s, sales were boosted by the success of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, and again by the success of the title track by Nirvana, recorded for an MTV Unplugged appearance in 1993. The album is now having a new lease of life through the band Holy Holy, which is ex-Spiders from Mars Woody Woodmansey's band, and featuring producer-bassist Tony Visconti. During an interview from 2015 for Gibson.com about the forthcoming tour, Tony Visconti had this to say about the making of the album The Man Who Sold the World. Quote, "We were brave young dudes. We felt we could do just about anything in the studio by then, and we left no stone unturned. We played powerfully and got into some very atonal areas. It was truly an art rock album, although that term didn't exist yet." He went on to say, "Bowie played all the acoustic guitar in the album. We all sang backing vocals. It was a little ahead of its time, kind of Queen-like." End quote. Back in those early days of 1970, the rhythm section comprised of Tony Visconti on bass and John Cambridge on drums. There was a vital element missing, and drummer John Cambridge set the wheels in motion by putting forward a friend of his named Mick Ronson. Tony Visconti spoke about Mick Ronson for an interview in Folk and Rock. Quote, "The Man Who Sold the World wouldn't be the great Dark Horse album it is without Mick Ronson. He inspired the rest of us to rock out like we'd never done before. I think both David and I knew we had to do something more dramatic and powerful for the next album, and being introduced to Mick was our good fortune." End quote. So, in those early months of 1970, Tony Visconti and Mick Ronson constructed a small makeshift studio beneath the stairwell of Bowie's Haddon Hall home and set to work demoing tracks for the album. In March, under the name of Hype, which in essence was a backing band for Bowie, a first serious attempt to record a Man Who Sold the World track was attempted at Advision Studios, Gosfield Street in London. And that song was The Superman, and it was at this session that John Cambridge was relieved of his drumming duties, apparently having had problems with the percussion elements in the song. It was at Mick Ronson's request that Cambridge be replaced by a member of his former band, The Rats, named Mick Woody Woodmansey. This also meant that 3 members of the future Spiders from Mars were now in place. In his autobiography, Tony Visconti stated, quote, "When we started the album, David hadn't yet written enough material, and this was about to become a new, angst-ridden, for me, style of working. He went on to say, "This caused me to feel some apprehension as we were on a tight schedule, but it set the tone for the rest of the album, and I constantly ask myself, will he or won't he finish these songs on time? End quote. So, The Man Who Sold the World would become a template for Bowie's and Visconti's future work together. Bowie had had 2 albums before this, and it might have been Space Oddity that gave Bowie a profile in pop, but The Man Who Sold the World is, in my opinion, the birth of the real Bowie, the Bowie that I, as a fan, would never desert and have followed through the years. It began the journey towards Ziggy and Aladdin Sane, to the Thin White Duke and the Experimentalist of Lowland Heroes. It was indeed the beginning of a fantastic journey. Track 1, The Width of a Circle. The Width of a Circle ushers in the album in grand and ominous style. At over 8 minutes long, it's a snaking, scintillating epic. Davy Buckley in his book Strange Fascination calls it, quote, a frightening art-pop behemoth. It contains one of Mick Ronson's most explosive moments on a Bowie album, as his lead guitar soars through the mix, the perfect riposte to Bowie's tale of transmogrification. He then goes on to say, in the second half of this 9-minute thriller, Bowie describes a homoerotic encounter with God in the Devil's Lair. End quote. In his book The Complete Bowie, Nicholas Pegg describes it as, quote, David's familiar acoustic guitar, together with an ever-shifting melodic landscape and a cryptic narrative meandering through Eastern spiritualism, hardcore sex, and a paraphrase of the Teddy Bear's Picnic, as in you'll never go down to the gods again, and ensure that this is a true Bowie original. End quote. It's this strangeness of lyrical twisting and turning that stops any sense of boredom setting in, due to the track's length. It's simply too weird to ignore, too overtly otherworldly and involving to be anything other than a journey best travelled to the very end. The Width of a Circle begins with a brief squealing feedback, then into a foreboding, sliding guitar riff that sets the tone for everything that follows. It puts me in a place that's dark, almost gothic in feel, an atmosphere of palpable unease. It could be horror, but somehow it's too surreal for that, as the narrator meets his doppelganger sleeping by a tree, then proceeds to converse with his other self, then in turn to a blackbird, and from there on in, the surrealistic nature of the proceedings escalates. Tony Visconti's bass bubbles and snakes around in melodic runs that belie the fact that for Visconti, at the time, this playing style was a new approach to the instrument. He explains to Scotsman.com how it was down to Mick Ronson's teaching. Quote, Mick said, you gotta listen to Jack Bruce, that's where I'm at. So he played me some Cream records and I got it. I took control over the lead bass playing on that album. It was so much fun to be liberated from just playing the thumping low end. There are a couple of duels on that album, Mick and I just flying around like a pair of eagles. It's probably one of my best moments as a bass player. End quote. The perfect foil for Tony Visconti was Woody Woodman's solid, inventive drumming, and David Bowie recalled years later that, quote, he was quite open to direction and in a way sort of carried out what I wanted done much more than most of the other drummers I've worked with. His strengths definitely were in the area of British rock and British rhythm and blues. End quote. It's this incendiary ensemble playing in The Width of a Circle that sets the scene for the whole album, hammering home the fact that despite this song and others having quieter moments, The Man Who Sold the World remained Bowie's heaviest album up until the release of Tin Machine. So thanks for listening. I hope you'll join me soon for part 2 of my historical account of David Bowie, The Man Who Sold the World. All links can be found in YouTube descriptions. Until the next time, bye bye.
You see